In this video, I'm going to show you how I went from this ugly slab to an only slightly less ugly table. Every time I buy a slab, and by that I mean the 2 times I've bought a slab, I instantly start regretting it once I get home, which is why I'm inspecting it right here. The reason I start regretting it, oh, there goes the brake light. The reason I start regretting it is because they can look kind of ugly, and it's hard to see potential for beauty in ugly things. Something I've been told many times. I wanted to weigh the slab before I got started just so I could impress people with how much it was. So I picked it up and stepped on this scale, which was in kilograms for some reason, but it ended up being 260. So then minus my weight, it was about 160 pounds, which is pretty crazy. I let the slab acclimate a couple days in the shop, and after that I needed to cut it up, but I didn't really have a good idea of what it was going to look like, so I decided to just throw together a quick model to kind of visualize the different pieces of the table that I wanted, and so here's a quick render of that, which hopefully will make it easier to see why I'm cutting what. Since the slab is so thick and I didn't want to use my table saw to make these cuts, I was going to have to cut on both sides, so here I'm just tracing the line over. I should have understood this wasn't going to work as soon as my table saw started sounding like a woodpecker, but I pushed on, hoping that this would make it faster and easier. It did not. You can definitely tell it's getting worse. At least I had a good long life of 2 projects. I ended up using my track saw and got this really cool shot where you can see everything. Now it's time for the second half of the table, but since we've already endured so much cutting, I'll make this part fast. I didn't feel like I needed to flatten perfectly both halves, just because I'm going to do that after the epoxy. So I'm just kind of smoothing the 2 halves down here. There are a couple of knots in the slab with some rotted wood in there, so I'm just cleaning that out. I wanted to show that I cleaned up the edges a bit, but I know that it can be a pretty boring thing to watch, so I kept it as short as I could. The live edges of the slab had some rotted wood, some soft wood, so I just wanted to chisel off that weak wood so that I could get to the firm, strong maple. this point I have the two halves of the table pretty much ready to go, and so I just needed to build the form for pouring the epoxy. That's the base ready to go. Now I just have to make the walls. I decided last minute here to check to make sure that the saw wasn't going to hit the table saw. It turns out it was going to hit it, so I'm adjusting it a little bit here. Now I'm just using some caulk to put it all together. I'm not sure the screws are entirely necessary, but I like to add them just in case. There were a couple holes on each half of the slab, and I wanted to fill them with epoxy at some point, so I just put some of this tape on the bottom, covering those holes so that it wouldn't seep through. After that, I put a bead of caulk along the bottom of each half so that the epoxy wouldn't seep underneath. Something that caused me a lot of grief last time was getting the table out of the mold, so this time I sprayed on a ton of mold release. I spent a lot of time making sure there wasn't going to be any leaks, but wanted to put this down just in case. And then all I had to do was make sure it was level so that the epoxy was equally distributed across the whole mold. The temperature was lower than ideal for pouring epoxy, so I just added in this heater to help with that. I'm not sure it'll make a difference, but I wanted to at least try. Once all the setup was complete, I could finally pour the epoxy. I added these little caulk dams just in case when I was filling the holes, if the epoxy were to overflow, it wouldn't go too far. This is how it looked after sitting out overnight, which is a good sign. I didn't have quite enough epoxy to fill the mold to the top, which meant I had to wait a couple more days for more epoxy to get there. And so the epoxy had hardened, and I've seen that you're supposed to kind of scuff up the hardened epoxy if you're going to add another layer. It had only been 3 days, but this stuff was already rock solid. And this screwdriver wasn't working very well, so I ended up sanding it. I bought the smallest amount of epoxy I could find, and I was a little worried at first it wasn't going to be enough, but it was plenty for the rest of the river and the couple of knots that I filled in. This hole wouldn't stop taking epoxy, which could mean that I missed something on the bottom of the table, but I didn't think I did, so I just kept giving it more. This was my first attempt at protecting the epoxy from dust. Turns out the mold release didn't really do anything at all, so this next part is how to make 2 hours of misery look like 1 minute of fun. Turns out that knot I kept filling up did leak a little bit, which is what this is here. And now, by far the worst part of the project, flattening the slab. The part I swore that I would never do again, but I just couldn't justify the cost of outsourcing it. Now I'm just squaring up the sides of the table. This track saw I couldn't get it to cut a perfect 90-degree angle, but it was pretty close. To save some time, I'll only show 5 seconds of sanding. Now I'm just getting rid of the sharp edges by putting an 1/8 of an inch round over on each side. There were still a lot of little dings and holes in the wood, and so I just filled those up with CA glue, which came with this spray which makes it cure instantly. After those touch-ups I did a lot more sanding, but I have too much respect for your time to show you any of that. For the legs I bought this pair on Amazon, which were relatively cheap. I used them last time I built the table and they worked pretty well. I didn't record this, but I made a mark where each of the holes needed to go for the threaded inserts. Once the legs were good to go, I could finally put some finish on the table. I started by cleaning off both sides with mineral spirits just to get all of the dust from sanding off. I let it sit and dry for a bit, and then I mixed up the finish, which is a hard wax finish called Rubio Monocoat. And now for the moment of truth. Is the table slightly less ugly than the slab that it came from? Or was this all just a waste of time? Or both? After I applied the finish, I had to buff it all off, which was fairly difficult because it was all gummy because it was so cold out. I finished the bottom side first so that I could flip it over and set it on those two pieces of melamine, which I placed right where the legs are going to go so any marks that it makes won't be seen. For this side I carried around this heater to try to loosen up the wax a little bit while I was buffing it. I didn't really notice a difference. This table definitely isn't the most beautiful thing I've ever made, but I think it at least keeps the title of this video from being clickbait. This table is less ugly than the slab it came from, in my subjective opinion.